Sloane Hadley pointed straight at him. "Get off my property. Now." Her voice carried across the whole yard. The neighbors heard. The man just stood there, muddy boots, quiet eyes, holding a pair of garden shears, like he had nowhere else to be. She had the survey, she had the filing, she had every right. Then her phone rang. Her own attorney. She almost didn't answer, but she did. And for a long moment, she said nothing at all, because what he whispered on the other end of that call was 4 words she wasn't ready for. Sloane. The deed is his. The morning Caleb Merritt drove Lily to school, he took the long way. Not because traffic was bad. Not because Lily asked him to. He took it because the long way went past the row of oak trees he and Sarah had planted the spring after they moved in. 7 years ago, when Lily was 2, and the house still smelled like fresh paint, and everything felt like it was only just beginning, he slowed the truck near the fence line. Didn't stop, just let his hand rest against the doorframe for a moment, looking out at the trees, 4 of them, now taller than the fence by a good 6 feet, their roots deep in their canopies touching at the edges. Lily didn't notice him looking. She was watching a bird on a telephone wire and talking about something that had happened at recess the week before. He listened to her voice and kept his eyes on the trees until the road curved away and they disappeared from the mirror. That was Tuesday morning. By Tuesday afternoon, Sloane Hadley was back at the offices of Hadley and Crane on Water Street, sitting across from Douglas Crane with a cup of coffee she hadn't touched. Crane was 64 years old and had been practicing real estate law in Charlottesville for 32 of them. He had white hair, steady hands, and the kind of patience that came from knowing how most things ended before they started. He set down the survey report and looked at her. "The trust filing is clean," he said. "The 2019 survey has the court's stamp. The man has been living on that property informally for years, without ever asserting legal title. That makes him a squatter with a sob story." He leaned back. "Send the notice." Sloane looked at the survey. She looked at the filing number. She thought about the man outside, the way he had stood there. Not angry. Not afraid. Just present in a way she couldn't quite categorize. "I will," she said. She did. That evening, she drafted the formal notice herself, rather than handing it off to a paralegal. 14 days to vacate the disputed parcel. Standard language. Her signature at the bottom. She noticed as she sealed the envelope that there was no firm listed on his side. No attorney of record. No corporate entity. Just the name Caleb Merritt and an address that put him less than a quarter mile from the fence line she'd stood at that morning. She mailed it and didn't think about it again. He found it in the mailbox that evening when he walked back from checking the irrigation line along the western edge of the property. He read it at the kitchen table, while Lily finished her homework across from him, her pencil moving in slow, careful circles on a worksheet about fractions. "Dad," she looked up. "Is something wrong?" He folded the paper along its original crease. "Nothing we can't fix," he said, and smiled at her in the way that always settled her, steady, unhurried, meaning it. After she went to bed, he sat alone at the table. The kitchen light was still on. Outside the window, the oak trees were dark shapes against a darker sky. He didn't reach for his phone. He didn't call anyone. He sat there a while, then got up and opened the drawer beside the refrigerator, the one where he kept takeout menus and dead batteries and things he didn't have another place for, and pulled out a manila envelope. The paper was old. The edges were soft with age, the color of weak tea. He set it on the table, looked at it, then he turned off the overhead light and went to bed. The envelope stayed on the table, lit only by the small bulb above the stove, waiting for morning. He arrived at Hadley and Crane at 8:15 the next day. He had not called ahead. He walked through the glass front door in his work clothes, a faded blue flannel shirt, dark canvas pants, boots that still had mud on them from the previous afternoon. The reception desk was manned by a young woman who looked up with practiced pleasantness, and then let the pleasantness slip slightly when she took in what he was wearing. "I'd like to see Miss Hadley," he said. "Tell her I'd like 5 minutes." His voice was even. Not polite in the performed way of someone trying to get something. Just even, the way a person sounds when they're not worried about the answer either way. The receptionist made the call. There was a pause. Then she looked up and said Miss Hadley would see him. Sloane met him in the second conference room, the smaller one, without the view. She had chosen it deliberately, though she couldn't have said exactly why. He sat down across from her and placed the manila envelope on the table between them, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "You received the notice," she said. "I did." She waited. He opened the envelope and slid a document across the table. It was old, genuinely old. The kind of paper that has survived multiple decades in a drawer or a box or a fireproof safe, yellowed at the edges but still legible. The ink still dark where it mattered. At the top, in typewritten letters. Deed of conveyance. Below that, a name. Elias Merritt. A date. 1923. And below that, a property description with boundary lines that included, in precise legal language, the full western strip of land running along the disputed fence line. There was a notary stamp. There was the seal of the Albemarle County Circuit Court. Sloan looked at it without touching it. "This is 100 years old," she said. "My client's filing is from 2019. The court recognized the updated boundaries at that time." "I know," he said. "That's why I'm asking whether anyone showed you the 1947 survey map. Not the 2019 one. The original one. The one that existed before the filing you're relying on." She said nothing. He looked at her not with challenge, not with contempt, with something more patient than either. Then he said, "Who are you exactly?" And she realized immediately that she had meant to ask him that and had let the document distract her. "Elias Merritt was my great-grandfather," he said. "My father was James Merritt. He placed this land in a family trust before he died. The trust was never legally dissolved." She stopped. She knew the name James Merritt. Everyone in Charlottesville real estate law knew the name James Merritt. He had been one of the largest private landholders in Central Virginia, a man who had spent 4 decades quietly accumulating agricultural parcels across 3 counties before his death 4 years ago. His estate had been handled by a firm in Richmond. She had never known he had children. She had never seen the name Caleb Merritt attached to anything. She looked at the man across the table, the muddy boots, the flannel, the calm that was starting to feel less like passivity and more like choice, and felt something shift in the room that she couldn't immediately name. He stood. "I'm not asking you to give up anything that's yours," he said. "I'm asking you to make sure it actually is." He left the copy of the deed on the table and walked out. Sloan sat in the conference room for a long time after he left. She looked at the 1923 deed. She looked at her own 2019 filing. She had spent 11 years practicing real estate law and had never once left a conference room uncertain about which side of a dispute she was standing on. She was uncertain now. She went to Crane's office the next morning and asked to see the full original file on the Merritt Trust. Not the digital summary, not the scanned copies in the system, but the physical file, the one with the original documents. Crane was at his desk reviewing another matter. He looked up, set his pen down, and told her the physical files for closed trust matters were kept in off-site storage. He'd have to request a retrieval. It would take a few days. She had worked alongside Douglas Crane for 12 years. She had never seen him pause before, answering a straightforward question about a file. She thanked him and left his office and drove to the Albemarle County Courthouse without telling anyone where she was going. The records room was on the 2nd floor, behind a door with frosted glass. Ruth Okafor had worked there for 26 years. She was a small woman with white hair cut close to her head and reading glasses that she wore on a chain around her neck. She spoke slowly and carefully, the way people do when they have spent decades being precise. Sloan gave her the parcel number and asked for the survey record history on the Merritt land. Ruth pulled a drawer. She searched through the files with practiced efficiency that slowed. As she got closer to where the 1947 map should have been, the slot was empty. In its place was a single document. The 2019 private survey, stamped by the firm that had conducted it. There was no court authentication signature. There was only the firm's own seal. Ruth stood with her hand resting on the open drawer. She did not look at Sloan. "Sometimes things get misfiled," she said. The pause that followed lasted several seconds longer than it should have. Sloan drove back to the office. She walked into Crane's suite without knocking and asked him directly, where was the 1947 survey map for the Merritt parcel? He told her it wasn't relevant. The boundaries had been re-established by the 2019 survey, which had been conducted by a licensed firm and accepted into the record. "By us," Sloan said. "We hired that firm." Standard practice. It's not standard practice to use a firm you hired yourself to override a century-old court-authenticated boundary without also producing the original map for comparison. Crane looked at her not the way he looked at a colleague who needed guidance, but the way he looked at a problem that had begun to require management. He told her she was overcomplicating something straightforward. She thanked him again and went back to her desk. She sat there for a while. On her desk was the notice she had sent Caleb Merritt's name typed at the top in the address block. On the wall was a photograph of her father, taken at the firm's 25th anniversary, his hand raised toward the camera in a half-wave, smiling. He had built Hadley and Crane on a single principle. He'd stated often enough that she'd long since memorized it. The law exists to find the truth, not to bury it. She didn't call anyone that night. She stayed at her desk until the cleaning crew came through at 9, then drove home on nearly empty streets, and sat in her car in the garage for a few minutes before going inside. She poured a glass of water she didn't drink. She went to bed and lay in the dark thinking about boundary lines, the ones drawn on maps, the ones drawn between professional obligation and personal judgment, the ones that had begun to feel, over the course of that long and difficult day, like they were not where she had always assumed they were. The law exists to find the truth, not to bury it. She had heard her father say it so many times that the words had stopped carrying weight somewhere in the middle of her career. They had become wallpaper, a motto, a thing you said at firm anniversaries and bar association dinners. She lay in the dark and said it to herself quietly. The way you say something when you're trying to remember what it actually means. And she let herself think. She came back to the property on a Thursday afternoon, and she came empty-handed. No folder under her arm, no yellow legal pad, no reason she could have given anyone if they had asked. She parked on the street and walked to the wooden fence and stood there in the early October light, looking at the oak trees, which were beginning to show the first traces of gold at the edges of their leaves. Caleb was near the far end of the property, pulling dead growth from along the base of the fence. He saw her. He didn't look surprised. She waited until he had walked over, and then she said, without preamble, "I'd like to see the 1947 map, the original. If you still have it." He looked at her for a moment, not measuring her hostility, she realized, but measuring something else. Whether the question was real, whether she had come because she was curious, or because she actually wanted to know. Then he opened the gate. The house was small. It sat back from the property line by maybe 30 feet, surrounded by the kind of gardening that looked purposeful but not ornamental raised beds along the south wall, a row of staked tomato plants, still clinging to the season's last fruit, 2 apple trees espaliered against the fence. Inside, it smelled like wood smoke and coffee. There were books on every available surface, stacked rather than arranged. On the walls, between a few framed photographs, were drawings, pencil, and watercolor, clearly made by a child. Oak trees, birds perched on fence posts, a cat that may or may not have been imaginary, all of them rendered with the kind of careful observation that didn't come from imagination alone. Sloane stood in front of one of the drawings longer than she meant to. He set the map on the kitchen table. It was larger than she'd expected a full survey map, folded into quarters, the paper soft with age but intact. When he unfolded it, she could read the boundary lines clearly. The western strip ran along the creek bed. The notary seal was from 1947, countersigned by the circuit court clerk. The boundary encompassed the full disputed parcel, including the corridor along the underground water channel that she now understood Crane had been trying to acquire for a commercial development project, worth several $1 million. "Why didn't you hire an attorney?" she asked, when you got the notice. He smoothed the edge of the map where it had started to curl. "I didn't want to fight," he said. "I just wanted to stay." It was a simple sentence. She had heard people say things like it before in depositions and mediation sessions and across tables not unlike this one. And it had always sounded like the opening of a negotiation. From him, it didn't sound like that. It sounded like the end of one. The door opened, and Lily came in from school, backpack still on, one of her shoes untied. She stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at Sloane with the frank curiosity of a 9-year-old who had not yet learned to disguise it. "Are you the lady from the fence?" she asked. "She's just visiting," Caleb said. Lily considered this, decided it was satisfactory. and disappeared down the hall toward her room. A moment later came the sound of a pencil case being unzipped. Sloane stood in the kitchen and felt, for the first time in several weeks, that she was not in the process of winning something. She wasn't sure yet whether that was a relief or something else entirely. The internal file request took 2 days to process. What came back was a transaction history for the Merritt Trust account that went back 12 years longer than Sloane had expected, predating James Merritt's death by nearly 8 years. Every document in the file had been handled directly by Crane. No paralegal had touched it. No associate had been looped in. For a trust of this size and complexity, that was unusual. For a trust with a property boundary dispute embedded in its history, it was something more than unusual. She read through the file 3 times before she went home. The following morning, Crane came to her office instead of waiting for her to come to him. He closed the door. He sat down across from her in the chair that clients usually sat in and leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, in the manner of someone delivering a difficult truth with reluctant kindness. "This account built this firm, Sloane," he said. "Your father understood that. Some clients require discretion, and discretion has served us well for a long time. Don't be sentimental about a man with muddy boots and an old piece of paper." She looked at him. She understood, hearing him say it that way, that he had known about the 1947 map before she had ever asked. He had known about it and had chosen not to show it to her when she took the case. That was not an oversight. After he left, she made a phone call. She didn't root through the firm's system. A land survey expert in Richmond, a man she had used twice before for litigation support, someone with no connection to Crane or to anyone Crane knew. She explained what she needed: an independent comparison of 2 boundary surveys for the same parcel, one from 1947 and one from 2019. She needed a professional opinion on whether any discrepancy between them was consistent with measurement error or with something more deliberate. He told her he could have something in 2 weeks. She said that was fine. Over those 2 weeks, she saw Caleb twice. Once, she was driving past the property in the early evening and saw him working along the fence line. And she stopped. He looked up, nodded, and went back to what he was doing. She stood there for a few minutes without saying anything and then drove on. Once, he came to the office. He had a supplementary property record she had asked him for, and he brought it in person, rather than mailing it. They stood in the hallway outside her office and drank coffee from paper cups and talked about the document, and then, when the document was covered, about nothing in particular. The silences between sentences were longer than they would have been a week earlier, and neither of them moved to fill them. She noticed, in the second of those 2 encounters, that she did not think about the case while they were talking. She thought about it the moment he left, immediately, efficiently, the way her mind always snapped back to unresolved problems. But while he was actually standing in the hallway with his paper cup and his unhurried way of being present in a conversation, she had simply been present too. It had been a long time since she'd had a conversation that worked that way. She wasn't sure what to do with that observation, so she filed it away in the part of her mind reserved for things she intended to return to later. On the second Thursday of the 2 weeks, she was working late and found herself looking at her father's photograph again. She knew what he would have done. She had known it for several days. The question, she was beginning to understand, was not what the right answer was. The question was whether she had the nerve for it. The report arrived on a Friday morning, emailed directly to her personal address. She printed it and read it twice at her kitchen table before she went to the office. The western boundary line in the 2019 survey was displaced 340 feet to the east of the boundary, established in the 1947 certified map. 340 feet, the precise width of the corridor containing the underground water channel. The expert's conclusion was stated in careful, professional language, but it was unambiguous. A discrepancy of this magnitude, consistent in direction and measurement, could not be attributed to equipment error or methodological difference. It was the result of a deliberate adjustment. She had been sitting with that for an hour when her office door opened. Ruth Okafor stood in the doorway in a fall coat, her reading glasses on their chain, a rigid envelope in her hands. She had not called ahead. She had not made an appointment. She simply set the envelope on the desk and sat down across from Sloane without being invited to. Inside the envelope was a photograph, high resolution, taken with a document camera of the 1947 survey map. The original. The one that should have been in the county records file. The boundary lines were clear. The notary seal was clear. Ruth had photographed it in full. He came to the records room in the spring of 2021, Ruth said. About 3 months after James Merritt died. He asked me to refile some of the documents in the Merritt parcel folder. He didn't say to destroy anything, but I understood what he meant. She paused. I made a copy first. I've kept it in my personal lockbox at the office for 3 years. Sloan looked at her. Why are you bringing it now? Ruth folded her hands in her lap. I'm retiring in 6 weeks, she said. I can't carry this out the door with me. There was nothing dramatic in the way she said it. No sense of triumph or relief. Just the plain statement of a woman who had held something heavy for a long time and had decided she was done holding it. After Ruth left, Sloan sat alone with everything spread across her desk: the expert's report, the photograph of the original map, the transaction history, the 23 deed. She did not need anything else. The picture was complete. The question now was not who was right. The question was what she was going to do with the answer, knowing that the answer was going to cost something she cared about. She thought about the name on the door of this building. She thought about the 22 years her father had run this firm before he handed it to her, and the decades she had spent trying to be worthy of what he had built. She thought about Douglas Crane, who had been here before her, who had helped build what she'd inherited, who had apparently been building something else alongside it for years without her knowing. She thought about Caleb Merritt standing in the conference room with his envelope and his quiet certainty, not asking for sympathy, only asking that she look at what was true. She thought about what it would cost to act. She thought about what it would cost not to. She picked up her phone and called Caleb. It was 8:15 in the evening. I need you to come in tomorrow, she said. Bring whoever you trust. A pause, 1 beat of silence, maybe 2. Then, I'll be there. He didn't ask what it was about. She put the phone down and sat in her office until the cleaning crew knocked on her door at 9:30. The meeting was at 9 the following morning. Sloan had booked the small conference room and arranged for an independent attorney, a woman named Patricia Wills, a litigator out of Roanoke, with no professional connection to Crane, to be present. Caleb came alone. He sat across from Sloan and Patricia Wills and said almost nothing while Sloan laid everything on the table. She went through it in order. The 1923 deed, the 1947 certified map, the missing record in the county archive, the 2019 private survey and its displacement, the expert's analysis, the transaction history. And finally, Ruth Okafor's photograph of the original map that had been removed from the public record 3 years ago. She did not editorialize. She did not ask for his reaction. She presented it the way she would have presented it in court, as a chain of documented fact. When she finished, there was a silence. Patricia Wills was writing something on her legal pad. Caleb sat with his hands on the table, looking at the documents arranged in front of him. Then he looked up at Sloan. Are you going to be okay? He asked. She had not expected that question. She had expected anger or satisfaction or questions about procedure. Not that. She looked at him for a moment. I'll be fine, she said. She filed a complaint with the Virginia State Bar that afternoon. Formal misconduct charges against Douglas Crane. Fraud upon the court. Manipulation of public records. Intentional conflict of interest. She submitted simultaneously to the Albemarle County Circuit Court a motion to reopen the 2019 boundary filing, attaching the expert report and the authenticated photograph of the missing original map. It was not a decision that had been hard to reach. It was only hard to execute. She understood, as she clicked send on the filing, that she was dismantling a significant portion of what she had spent her career building. The firm her father had started, the name on the door, the client relationships that went back before she had passed the bar. She did it anyway. Crane moved fast. Within the hour, he had invoked the conflict of interest clause in their partnership agreement, arguing that her involvement in the Merritt matter and her subsequent adverse action against him constituted grounds to remove her from active management of the firm. She had anticipated this. 2 weeks earlier, when she had first begun to understand where things were heading, she had consulted Patricia Wills quietly on exactly this question. The clause Crane was citing did not apply when the conflict arose from the other party's own deliberate misconduct. He had no more moves. By 4 in the afternoon, The building was quieter than usual. Most of the staff had gone home early. Patricia Wills had left. Sloan was alone in the conference room, gathering documents into folders, when she realized Caleb was still there. He was standing in the doorway, his jacket on, not quite leaving. "You didn't have to do it this way," he said. His tone was not accusatory. He meant it the way it was. She could have found a narrower path. She could have helped him recover the land without filing against Crane, without the bar complaint, without making it public. She had chosen the larger version. "Yes, I did," she said. He nodded once, the way he did when something had been said completely enough that there was nothing to add. When she looked up a few minutes later, he was still in the doorway. Neither of them said anything else. She went back to sorting papers, and he stayed. The Albemarle County Circuit Court issued a preliminary injunction within 10 days, halting all development activity on the disputed parcel pending review. The Virginia State Bar opened a formal inquiry into Crane's conduct. His attorney advised him, before the inquiry could become a public hearing, to resign from the partnership. He did. The name Hadley and Crane came down from the office door on a Wednesday morning. A building maintenance worker unscrewed the letters while Sloan watched from the lobby. It took about 4 minutes. The trust restoration order came through 2 weeks later. The court reinstated the 1947 boundary map as the controlling document and restored the Merritt family trust to its original scope. The independent attorney called Caleb with the news. He said thank you and put the phone down. That afternoon he walked home from wherever he'd been and sat under the oak trees with Lily until the light changed. "Is it over?" she asked him. "The hard part is," he said. Sloan, meanwhile, was sitting behind her father's desk for the first time. She had moved into his office, not because she wanted the symbolism, but because her office was being used for document storage during the transition. Client calls came in throughout the day, some expressing support, some asking careful questions about continuity, a few withdrawing their files without comment. She answered every call herself. It was not the outcome she had imagined when she'd taken the Merritt case. Nothing about the past 3 weeks looked the way she'd expected anything in her career to look. But when she sat at her father's desk and looked out at Water Street and the courthouse dome visible past the trees, she felt something she hadn't felt in years or possibly ever in this room, which was the sense that the name on the door, whatever name it would become, was hers to carry forward on her own terms. That evening she drove to the property. She parked on the street and walked to the wooden fence. The late afternoon light was horizontal and gold, the kind that made everything look like a memory while it was still happening. She stood outside the gate, the same spot she had stood the morning she'd told him to leave. She wasn't carrying anything. Caleb was near the back of the property. He saw her and walked over. He didn't ask why she was there. He opened the gate and stepped back. She walked in. They went along the fence line together without talking. The oak trees were past their peak color now, the leaves starting to loosen. He told her about Sarah, not much, not the whole story, just the parts that explained the land. How Sarah had been the one to plan the tree planting. How she'd drawn a diagram on a paper napkin at breakfast one morning and said, "These 4, right here, because they'll touch when they're grown." How that had turned out to be true. He told her the Western Strip had been where they used to walk after Lily went to bed in the first years before it got hard. He said the land remembered the shape of a life even after the person who made it was gone. Sloan listened. She didn't try to match it with something of her own. She let the space after his words be space. The oak leaves on Water Street were nearly gone by the time Sloan finished rebuilding what was left of the firm. She filed the paperwork to rename it Hadley Law in the first week of November. A younger partner named Marcus Webb joined in the second week, someone with a clean record and the kind of careful ethics she was in no mood to compromise on. The firm's caseload was smaller, the client list was shorter, but every file in the cabinet was one she could defend without reservation, and that felt, after everything, like the correct foundation. There were mornings when she sat at her desk and felt the absence of what had been there before, the size of it, the weight of the name, the particular confidence that comes from standing inside something already built. There were other mornings when she sat at the same desk and felt the opposite of that. She was still working out the ratio. Caleb did not change much that anyone could see. He tended the property the same way he always had, methodically, without urgency. as though the work was its own reward rather than a means to something else. He had not called the people from his previous life. He had no interest in doing so. The world he'd left after Sarah died had asked things of him that he was no longer willing to give. And the world he had built here asked only that he show up and pay attention. He could do that. He was good at it. Some mornings he walked the fence line before Lily woke up, just to know the shape of the land in the early light, the way the frost lay differently in the low spots near the creek, the way the oak trees looked before the day had fully started. On a Wednesday afternoon, he pushed open the door of the office on Water Street that now said Hadley Law in plain black letters and set 2 paper cups of coffee on the reception desk. He walked back to Sloane's office, his father's office, she had once told him, though she'd said it without sentiment, and put one of the cups on her desk. "You look like you could use this," he said. She looked up at him. Flannel shirt, paper cup, steady eyes, and she smiled, not the measured professional smile she used in conference rooms, but something else, something less practiced and more accurate. A few days later, he brought an envelope, Lily's drawing, folded in quarters. A piece of watercolor paper soft from being handled. When Sloane unfolded it, she found a row of oak trees rendered in careful pencil, with 2 figures in the drawing, one outside the fence and one inside, both facing the same direction, both looking at the trees. He handed it to her without explanation. She held it for a long time before she put it down. She set it on her desk, not in a drawer, and did not take it home. The last of the oak leaves came down in the 3rd week of November. The Merritt property went quiet, in the way that land goes quiet in late autumn, not empty, just still. Everything that needed to be done for the year already done. Caleb worked slowly on those days, unhurried in a way that was different from the unhurried way he had worked in the summer. He was paying attention to things he had walked past for 3 years, the way the light moved across the creek bed at noon, the sound the gate made when the wind pushed it, the shadows of the oak trees lengthening each afternoon by a few minutes more. He was paying attention to other things too, the way a car slowed on the street sometimes before it reached the house, the way the kitchen felt different when there was someone else in it, even briefly, the way Lily had started drawing 2 figures into her tree pictures without being asked, as if it had simply become the correct composition. Sloane had become a regular presence in the life of that land and the small house beside it, though no one had announced it and nothing had been declared. She came without calling. She left when the evening made it natural to leave. She had learned to stand next to a man who did not need explanations, and to let his silences be what they were. He had learned, slowly, to leave the gate unlatched when there was a chance she might come. These were small adjustments, private ones, the kind that don't announce themselves, but that change the shape of a day. Nonetheless, Lily moved through all of it the way children move through things that make sense to them naturally, without comment, the way she'd moved through the first visit and every visit after. She was inside now, at the kitchen table, her lamp making a yellow square on the wall through the window. Her pencil moved across paper with the focused concentration of someone working on something important. At the fence, in the last of the afternoon light, Caleb and Sloane stood on his side of the old wood rail. There was no reason for either of them to be at the fence at that particular moment. There was also no other place they were needed. She was looking at the oak trees. He was looking at her, looking at them. "You can come back," he said. Not to the fence, to the gate, to the property, to whatever was inside it, that she had been standing at the edge of for weeks now. Whenever you want. It wasn't a question. It wasn't an invitation offered lightly. It was the kind of thing a person says when they have thought about it enough to be certain. She didn't answer right away. The wind moved through the oak branches. One leaf let go and turned slowly down through the still air and came to rest on the fence rail between them. She looked at it, then she looked at him, then she nodded once, slowly, the way she signed documents that she had read all the way through and decided to be bound by. Neither of them had been looking, and maybe that was exactly why it found them.